In building a no-code app, you are likely looking for freedom, flexibility, and control over your income and your lifestyle. And an app-based business can help you achieve those things. It's one of the most scalable business models there is. But is it the most scalable business model out there? And is it right for you, or should you potentially be considering another? Well, in this video, we're going to break down 5 different business models and compare their upfront investment costs, their operating expenses, and something I call their scale friction. This is going to help you understand whether an app-based business model is really going to help you achieve what you're after. Now, make sure you stick around until the end because we're also going to talk about one specific factor that can add even more value to the business model you choose. Hey, it's Kristen over at Coaching No Code Apps. We help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. And if that's what you're doing, then subscribe for new videos to help you every single week. Now, before we jump into comparing these 5 business models, we actually need to properly define scale. Now, this might sound really obvious, but there is growth and then there's scale. And you need to understand the difference between the two before we go any further. What we're going to look at is money over here and time, because these are really the two big factors that come into play. So when we're talking about growth, what we usually see is an increasing revenue, right? So a business is growing, but what we also see is an increasing amount of expenses. So we have revenue here and we have expenses here. So essentially, a business can grow and grow and grow, but not really become that much more profitable. The revenues can go up, but the expenses go up right alongside that. Now, over time, ideally, if you were to look at the trajectory of each of these, that gap is going to widen, but not exponentially. Now, when we look at scale, that's where things get different. So scale is when you have that same increasing revenue. Let's just say they're the exact same in this example. So we have revenue here, but what's different is the expenses. Okay, so the expenses don't grow at the same rate the revenue grows. So essentially, the business's growth is not as attached or held back by the money that's being put into it, or the operating expenses, the investment expenses. Okay, so growth and scale are actually two different things. Now, neither of these is right or wrong. It's just some business models are going to be more scalable than others. So when we think about an app-based business model, for example, you can have thousands, tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of users with a relatively small team. But when you think about maybe a brick and mortar business, if you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of customers, you're going to have substantial operations to support that. Okay, so the difference between growth and scale is important because now we're going to go into talking about those 5 business models and we can apply this concept to those. All right, so first things first, in comparing these business models, we're going to be looking at the upfront investment, and we'll actually come back to this a little bit later. We're going to be looking at ongoing operating expenses, and then we're also going to be looking at something I call scale friction. So essentially, how hard is it for this business model to actually achieve scale, defined in the way that we've already gone over? All right, going back to the iPad here, we're going to compare these business models based on the expenses and the scale friction. And we're looking at 5 business models, so we're going to write them out over here. And these are all going to be very different models so that we can see a true comparison of them. So first up, we have brick and mortar businesses. So these are physical stores that you might go into. And then we're going to have physical service-based businesses. So not necessarily brick and mortar, there might not actually be a storefront, but we're looking at services where the service provider either, comes to your home in person or works with you in person, that type of thing. And then we're going to look at online service-based business models or the service-based business model. And this is the same sort of thing, right? We still are offering services, but we're doing it online. So we're not, we don't have machinery or equipment, for example, like a physical service-based business might. Think about a contractor, for example, who goes and fixes something in your home. Well, they're going to have equipment, whereas an online service-based business is not going to have that same equipment collection or the storefront or the physical base or anything like that. And then we're going to compare digital information products or businesses. And this is like when a business sells courses online or training. Okay, you've seen these. And then we are going to compare app-based business models at the very end, okay? And this is obviously what you're probably interested in right now. So we have these very 5 different business models, and what we're gonna do is compare the operating expenses to the scale friction, because I want you to see how these business models are not necessarily going to operate, but I guess the types of expectations you need when going into this type of business model, or where you might have the biggest advantages based on the one that you choose. Okay, so we're looking at an upward sort of line here with these comparisons. Now let's start with brick and mortar. So unsurprisingly, we're going to plot a brick and mortar business all the way up at the top right. So this is the business that's going to have the highest operating expenses, and it's going to have the most scale friction. Now, when you think of operating expenses for brick and mortar businesses, we have the lease, right? So you have to have a space in which you operate out of. So a lease, or maybe if you own an office space, you have to have staff that you have in person. You have to have inventory, stock, which is a very high expense, right? And then when you think about scale friction, let's talk about doubling the size of a business and what that might look like. So in order to double the size of a brick and mortar business, so double the revenue, double the customer base, and so on, well, if you have a brick and mortar business in one specific location, and this assumes that that business is actually doing well, it's performing well, well, in order to double the size, you are likely going to have to look in another location, and you're going to have to go into an additional lease and hire additional staff. And depending on where that location is, let's say you are personally operating or managing the first location. Well, if you have another location, maybe it's farther away from you and you can't get there every day, well, you're going to have management positions. So now higher paid staff. You're going to have double the inventory. So you can see, in order to double the business, we need to essentially double the expenses. That means there's a lot of scale friction. It's hard to scale. To then quadruple the business, what do you have to do, right? And so on. So now let's look at physical service businesses. We're actually going to plot this a little bit lower. We'll put PS for physical services. And this one is going to be a little bit lower on the expenses side, because for a physical service-based business, you don't technically have to have a storefront, although you might, but for the size of the customer base to grow, you likely don't need to replicate that storefront each and every time like you would a brick and mortar business. And again, you might not even need that storefront to begin with, depending on the actual business that it is. So for a physical service business, you do need equipment and you do need staff. And again, we're looking at businesses that are aiming to grow and or scale ideally. So you could have a one-person physical service-based business, but we're looking bigger here, right? So in order to grow, you would need to increase the equipment, increase the staff, increase the, time spent training and all of that. So the expenses are going to be lower, and the scale friction is going to be a little bit lower too, because there's not that friction of having a lease in a different location and everything that's involved with that, or even staffing in that location or providing management in that location. Because with a physical service based business, you can have your home base in one city and your technicians or your agents or whatever they might be can technically travel to other locations. So maybe you expand the neighborhoods you service or the subdivisions or the towns, the cities, whatever it is, but without really having to replicate your business in those locations. So there is going to be a higher expense, right? There is going to be friction in order to scale, because you're going to have more equipment, more staff, and so on, but not as much as that brick and mortar business. Okay, so now let's look at online service-based business. So we're going to say OS for online services. This is where we come a lot lower down, because the expenses, you are eliminating any physical overhead or any physical equipment, and that's huge because those expenses can be really high. Now, depending on the business and depending on the team, you might have office space still. Maybe you work out of a co-working space, or maybe you rent office space part-time and you work remotely part-time. So the expenses are going to come way down. But with online service-based businesses, you're generally going to be looking at a higher skill level, right? Because you're going to be looking at, instead of labor, which often happens with physical service-based businesses, not all the time, but you're going to be looking more towards knowledge or consulting or coaching. So you're going to be looking at a higher level of skill. So in order to grow and scale, you are going to need more staff, more employees, more team, but they are going to likely need a higher skill level. That means they are going to cost more than someone who you might staff in a physical service-based business that is more labor focused. So the expenses aren't going to drop all the way down. They're going to drop significantly, but you're still going to have to think of that skill level. Now with scale friction, you have a lot less friction in order to scale here, because you are not held down by location, generally, okay? Maybe depending on the business, but generally you're going to have a whole host of other options when it comes to the locations you serve, the clientele you serve. Okay, so the scale friction comes down a lot. Now there still is some, because you are going to have to source your talent, but you have a much wider pool if you are remote, right? Because you're generally not going to be tied to a specific location. So scale friction is down, expenses are down. This is a great business model, especially when you're just starting out, because you can start out as a one-person service-based business online and grow from there a lot more easily than with the physical services, and especially the brick and mortar. Okay, so going down now, let's look at the digital info product. So we have DI, digital info. So we're looking at courses, training, right? Things that a customer can come and buy, and you are personally not delivering it live. Or maybe you are, but it's to a very big audience. But generally, we're looking at buying courses, buying training, things like that. Now, this one is one of the lowest expenses and one of the most scalable business models that you can have, because really, you can create that information, that product once, and maybe update it over time or add to it over time, but you can sell it to hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people potentially from this one information product that you created once. That's incredibly, one, low cost. The costs are going to be variable, depending on the production quality and that type of thing. But relatively speaking, if we had 100,000 people buy a course, and that course was, say, $500, and let's say We spent $5,000 initially to produce the course. Well, we are going to have a very scalable business model, especially considering we probably don't have to have a very big team to support this. Maybe we do on the customer service side. In terms of scale friction, it's very low, right? Because again, you don't need a very large team size. You can sell potentially all over the world depending on what it is you're selling. So a really scalable and low-cost business model here. Okay, so now we're going to look at an app-based business model. So we're actually going to go off the line here, and we're going to put it at the same level of scale friction as that digital info product, but we're actually going to put it a little bit higher in terms of expenses. Now you might be thinking, I thought you were going to tell me that an app-based business was the best possible one out there, and this is contradictory to that. But number one, best is relative. But secondly, we haven't talked about upfront investment yet in detail. And that's where this really comes in. So with a digital info product, you're going to have a lower upfront investment in order to get it out there and start selling it. I mean, realistically, you can have a very low production quality. Obviously, it needs to be usable or consumable, but if the information is there and it gets people the right results, well, it's sellable, right? And so the upfront investment for a digital information product is very low. Now, this doesn't account for the audience because it obviously, that comes into play. In order for that business to scale, you have to have a growing audience or customer base. And that can cost a lot of time and money depending on how you are acquiring those customers. But right now we're just looking at actually getting the business out the door. Okay, so a landing page, the actual product, a checkout, right? There we have it, okay? With an app, the expenses are going to be higher, the upfront expenses, okay? Because with an application, let me rewind just a little bit. Traditionally, with an app, you'd have to outsource the development and pay, tens of thousands, $100,000 plus for the initial version or versions of your product. Very expensive. That would put our upfront investment way higher with an app. But because of no-code tools, we're able to bring that way down. Now, expenses, or rather upfront investment, is still going to be a little bit relative here. There are variables because you could spend the next 3 years learning how to use no-code tools, learning development strategy, learning launch strategy, and that type of thing. And your upfront investment in terms of finances could be really low. But if you did want to invest money in order to drastically shorten that time frame, let's say you want to take 3 years and turn that into 3 months, well, that's obviously going to require more of an investment because you're going to be getting help, coaching, training, for example, mentorship. But it's still going to be significantly lower than any physical-based business, physical services, brick and mortar, and it might be more on par with the online service-based business, right? It could be lower. Again, we won't go down, or kind of get in the weeds with that, but there is going to be a little bit higher of an upfront investment compared to the digital information product. Now, there is some caveat to this, and we're going to get to that later because I mentioned in the beginning of this video, there's one specific thing you need to think about that's going to increase the value. So we're not even talking about scalability or growth here, but value. Okay, so like the dollar amount you're going to put on your business, and that's going to come into play in a minute. So stick with me here, but let's go back to the iPad here. Okay, so upfront investment with the online service-based business, again, lots of potential factors here, but you might be thinking about training. Maybe you have to have certain certifications. Maybe if you have some initial staff to help you out, maybe you have a partner, maybe you have 1 or 2 employees, right? You're going to have a little bit more of an upfront investment here, but We could go the other way. You could start out as a one person, a freelancer, right? That is an online service based business. So you can bring this upfront cost down. But then when we have physical service based businesses, that upfront investment does spike up, right? Because again, you need that equipment. You probably need to be able to travel somewhere. You might need a storefront. You definitely need somewhere to house the equipment. You're going to need different types of insurance, right? So our expenses, our overhead start spiking here. And then of course, when we have that brick and mortar business, that's where things really get a lot higher because we do need that storefront and we have inventory and we have staff. So this is how you would really compare that upfront investment alongside your expenses and the scale friction. Okay, so that brings us to that one specific value add factor. And to me, this is where things get really interesting. So when we look at an application, or an app-based business model rather, we have a low or a high upfront investment, okay? Ideally on the lower side because you're using no-code tools. On top of that, we have low operating expenses. You really don't need a large team in order to grow, or you shouldn't need a large team if you have ironed out your operations. And you really shouldn't have high scale friction at all. With an app-based business model, your scale friction should be incredibly low. Now, we can compare that to the digital information product business model. And that one, the difference there is with the upfront investment. You can have a slim to none upfront investment compared to an app, with all other things staying the same. So you might think, well, that digital info product-based business is going to be the most ideal or the most scalable overall. But back to that one differentiator, what do you think of when you think of a normal digital information product-based business? You usually think of a face, a specific person who is associated with that course or that training. But what do you think of when you think of an app-based business model? Well, generally you think of the tech or the solution, right? And that's the big differentiator here. While it might generally cost more to launch an app-based business model, the value is generally going to be a lot higher. And value equates to sellability. Now, you might not want to sell your app, and that's okay. But in order to sell a digital information product, you have to really be specific about how you present that product or that business. You generally are going to have to remove the face. And if you've started as a one-person business, which many digital info products do, then you're going to have to drastically change your operations and your team. You're really going to have to operate a very different business in order to create a high-value business to sell. Okay, it's difficult to sell those businesses for a high amount of money, or rather what they're worth in terms of revenue, the revenue and the profits they bring in. But with an app-based business that is generally not attached to a face, this is a product. This is much more sellable, which means there's much more value, okay? Because if you look at the revenue and the profit, that is what is going to determine the sale price. Or there's going to be other factors, but just generalizing here, right? We're looking at the value of the product, whereas with the digital info product, we're not, because part of the value is generally the person. So if you ever wanted to sell a business like that, you'd probably have to work for whoever acquires the business, or you'd have to transition yourself out, or again, you'd have to, over time, drastically change your business in order to sell it. So whether or not you want to sell your business, this is something to think about because you can't predict the future. And hey, maybe at some point, you do want to sell, or you at least want to have the option to sell. Well, with an app-based business model, you have a higher likelihood of being able to do that. Again, assuming it's a successful business. But with that assumption, then an app-based business model is going to win out here. Now look, if you are interested in becoming a successful app entrepreneur, using no-code tools, and getting a high-value, low operational expenses business model out there, then head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop, where we will walk you through the next steps. We are going to get strategic with your app scope and your game plan in terms of development, testing, and launch. We're also going to get very technical with the no-code tools, making sure you're using the right tools and that you understand how to use them. We're also going to get strategic with development strategy. So essentially, this is where you need to start out if you want to become that no-code app entrepreneur who has the scalable app-based business model. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop. We hope to see you there. Thanks so much for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one.